Hello and welcome once again to The Blueprint, Canada's Conservative podcast. I'm your host, Jamie Schmale, Member of Parliament for Haliburton, Kawartha Lakes, Brock, broadcasting live from Lindsay, Ontario in my constituency office as we deliver this new COVID-19 special edition of The Blueprint. We've got a great show lined up for you, as always, so we need your help to get that message out. So please subscribe, share, comment, like the podcast, and help us push back against the ever-moving Liberal agenda. Coming up on the second half of the show, we have John Barlow. He's the Member of Parliament for Foothills. He's also the Shadow Minister for Agriculture and Agri-Food. We're going to talk about how Canada and our farmers, our agriculture community, is working so hard to keep our supply chain intact and allowing grocery stores to get the products on the shelves so that we are able to feed our society as we ask people to make some very difficult decisions in their life in terms of self-isolating and keeping away from their friends and relatives that they would normally associate with as we try to fight the spread of COVID-19, not only in Canada, but right across the world as well. Coming up first is my seatmate. As you remember, we used to, or I should say, on the last program, a couple of weeks ago, we had Gary on the show. Gary Vidal, he's the Member of Parliament for Northern Saskatchewan. He pretty much represents the northern half of the province. And we had some connection issues with him. So we said we'd get him back on. He has agreed to come on. So we're really excited to have Gary back on. But before I do this, I should, and Gary, maybe we can pull your screen up here. Thank you for being here, by the way.
My pleasure,
and probably something else you'd want to talk about as well is today is World Health Day. And of course, I think you share with me the thank you that we give to our healthcare workers and all the frontline professionals that are dedicated, that are showing their resilience as they undertake this very important role as Canada, as I mentioned, helps do its part in combating the spread of COVID-19.
Thanks, Jamie. Yeah, it's a pleasure to be with you. And of course, I would echo your appreciation for our health workers across my riding, across my province, across Canada, and across the world who have been on the front line protecting people, putting themselves at risk to protect us from this virus. So we can't say enough thanks to them. We appreciate them immensely. And I mean, that goes to the grocery store workers and the truck drivers and our agriculture people as well, who are working to maintain our food security. There's so many people that we owe a debt of gratitude in the midst of this crisis.
So Gary is also my seatmate in all of this. So I apologize for leaving it so long to having you on the show. I feel kind of bad. You're going to have to elbow me when the House of Commons resumes for not having you on sooner. But I should also mention that you are the Shadow Minister for Indigenous Services, which is like many of the portfolios, a very important one, especially when we're dealing with COVID-19 in First Nations communities.
Jamie, you know, I was very, very thrilled to be assigned this position as the Indigenous Services Shadow Minister. It's a great opportunity to have an impact on a lot of people across our country. And although it's a challenging file, I've always say that with great challenge comes great opportunity, and it's a great opportunity to impact the lives of people across our country. So I'm really enjoying the role.
Now, you're a former mayor, so you're used to dealing with not only First Nations communities, but looking after your area, your boundaries, your jurisdiction. And off air, before we started the show, you were kind of sharing some stories about how First Nations chiefs and their councils are looking after their communities and actually coming up with local solutions to some of the problems that some of these First Nations communities are dealing with.
You know what, it's been really really cool to see some of the leadership that's happened in the local First Nations and what they've been doing in their own communities. I mean, one of the things that we often think of in the First Nations communities is that they're somewhat isolated. They're somewhat away from the larger communities, from some of the larger centers, and that's both a blessing and a curse to some degree, because they maybe are further away from the risk of that nasty virus getting into their communities. But if it does get there, the risks are great as they try to deal with it. So it's both a blessing and a curse. And I've been really impressed with some of the leadership they've shown in their own preparation. And I think a lot of that goes back to their response to what happened back in the late 2000s with the H1N1 crisis, where they've prepared some pandemic plans and they're now executing the things they learned back then. The other really cool stories, there's a couple that I would share with you. One we've seen in one of my First Nations in northern Saskatchewan, where a group of people very early on, under the initiative of one individual in particular, they started a drive where they delivered meat packs to the elders and to the people vulnerable in their community. And their purpose was solely to make sure that these people were fed and well looked after, but also to prevent them from having to travel to the more central locations where they were concerned that they would potentially catch the virus and bring it back to their community. So some really, really great initiative in that particular community, and those people deserve credit for the work they've done. There's another group, they call themselves Men of the North, and it's in the community of La Ronge. And if you're not familiar with northern Saskatchewan, there's the area of La Ronge has a town and a northern village and a First Nation that border each other. It's like a tri-community. And this group was actually a men's support group that was started recently. And because they can't meet anymore, they've decided that they would serve their communities. And they're doing that by delivering food, by just offering their services. They're actually willing to go out and hunt and get game for the people in their community. So there's just some really, really cool stories out there of people doing great things to protect their communities, to help the people of their communities.
Now, as we mentioned right at the beginning of the COVID-19 crisis, as news was coming out of China in January, late January, February, and there was a great piece in the Edmonton Journal, I think a week or so ago, that actually showed the timeline on what health officials were saying, what was coming out of China, what we as the opposition were asking questions of the government about, the answers we were getting in response. But one of those set of questions that was asked was in regards to First Nations communities, where if a case of COVID-19 were to appear in one of the communities, especially those that are isolated, that could already be dealing with water issues, housing issues, how do we deliver the actual services to the people who would then be in need with yet another health crisis? And I think that's just an ongoing situation that the government's trying to deal with. But out of your experience, out of the Shadow Minister for Indigenous Services, how are you connecting the dots here to make sure that the health officials are even planning to get those supports in place?
So one of the things I've done is we've done a lot of engagement with our First Nations leadership to identify what the challenges on the ground are. We've talked to the leaders in the communities. We've talked to the tribal council leaders. We've talked to the provincial leaders. We've reached out to some national leaders and tried to identify maybe gaps, identify challenges. And what I've done is establish a relationship in Minister Miller's office to be able to communicate those directly to his office so that he can, take the lead on addressing those directly. So we've had some regular communication with the minister's offices when we see those areas that need addressing, and I have to admit they've been quite willing to work with us as we brought those forward. What we're seeing now is kind of the issue that we're seeing the most of now is just the supply issue, the masks, the gloves, the gowns, which is common across the country, but very common in our remote First Nations community. So we've been talking to the minister's office about that. We've taken some particular examples forward where, tribal council chiefs have talked to us about a shortage in their area. We've tried to help them address those things and make sure that those supplies are being met, those challenges are being met. The other thing in the remote communities that we've talked a fair amount with the minister's office is about the idea of utilizing the military to set up field hospitals to be ready to go when that need arises, or if that need arises in a particular area. And they've been assuring us that they have what they call surge resources in place. They have supplies, they have medical personnel, they have people ready to go, and they have the Army mobilized that if they need to act and they need to get to one of these remote areas, that they can get there very quickly. So we've just been trying to press the minister's office to make sure that, any stuff we hear they're prepared for and they're willing and ready to act.
I think that's and you raised a good point. The fact that there is a support network of being the military or other agencies that are prepared to act should a case of COVID-19 appear on some of these First Nations communities. But I guess it also highlights the situation that a lot of First Nations communities, especially those that are isolated, are dealing with on an ongoing basis. And when you tag in the economy into it as well, where some of these communities for in terms of opportunity is somewhat limited. So that's where the resource sector plays a part. That's where the mining industry plays a part, so that you are able to provide jobs, opportunity, and wealth to these First Nations communities. That will help, I think, in the long run, in their goals to be self-sustaining.
Yeah, absolutely. We've been I would suggest as a party, and Jamie, you and I on the Indigenous file, that we work together on. I think we've been strong advocates for the advancement of those resource opportunities that have huge impact on some of these remote First Nations communities. There's so many of these leaders that recognize their need to be involved in the economy. They recognize their need to participate. They need access to capital. They need to have the ability to invest in these projects for the good of their communities. They recognize that a lot of these opportunities may be once in a lifetime opportunities to address many of the poverty, many of the housing, many of the kind of community challenges they face from an infrastructure perspective, from a recreation perspective, from a healthcare perspective, from an education perspective. These leaders recognize their need to be part of the solution, and by participating in the economy, which is very much focused around the resource sector, as you suggested, they want to participate in that, and in some cases are being held back from that. So we've advocated and really tried to stand up for those people that want to participate in that resource sector economy.
It just seems like forever ago we were talking about the Coastal GasLink project and the blockades that affected a large portion of the Canadian economy, from agriculture to auto to many other resources, that type of thing, especially with LNG and others. So it just seems forever ago that we were dealing with that part of what was affecting our lives, and now we're dealing with basically a shutdown, all but essential services, keeping our country going at the moment, and that includes the transportation of goods.
Yeah, it does seem like it was forever ago, doesn't it? It was only a few weeks, but we were really on the forefront of that battle around the Coastal GasLink project, and I think we will continue to be there. I think we'll get there again, but you're right, our focus has changed to helping people deal with the issues of now, maybe, if I could say it that way. And I mean, as an example, even in the mining sector, one of the things going on right now is I have a very significant employer in my riding in northern Saskatchewan that's facing issues with their access to some of the programs that are being offered, and this is going to affect a large number of First Nations people in my riding in northern Saskatchewan. So before we came on this morning, that's one of the projects I'm advocating for today, is to make sure that some of the programs being offered, like the wage subsidy program, for example, are actually meeting the needs of the people on the ground, and there aren't significant people that are falling through the cracks, so that we kind of find ourselves in a bit of a different place than we were 3 or 4 weeks ago when we were advocating on behalf of Coastal GasLink and the people on the ground there.
I don't want to leave this topic because I think the resource industry, mining, is very key in terms of First Nations success and their path to prosperity. And but you did mention something that kind of tweaked my mind, is how we're dealing with the problems of now, and how the First Nations communities are dealing with their situation within their boundaries and also within their nation. And but also there's a component of First Nations communities in urban centers where friendship centers are playing a huge role in offering assistance.
You know what, Jamie, it's interesting. One of the people that sorry, let me back up a little bit. One of the goals I set out as a newly elected member was to build relationships with significant people in my riding. That was kind of the start of my journey. And then when I was appointed the shadow minister, my scope of building relationships broadened a little bit from about 25 First Nations to 630. So that was a bit of a big bite. But you and I have had this conversation. But One of the opportunities we had really early on with one of the people working for me in my local riding was to meet with one of the provincial leaders of friendship centers, and that was a great connection for us because we really started to learn about the impact that friendship centers were having on the Indigenous population that is in urban centers. And I think what a lot of people don't realize is that over 60% of First Nations people actually live in urban centers. And there's a real difference in how the jurisdictional matters get made up when a First Nation person leaves their reserve. They're still a member of the reserve, but they fall under a very different jurisdictional makeup when they move to an urban setting. They fall under a bunch of provincial jurisdictions instead of federal jurisdictions. So as this crisis developed, one of the organizations that we've had some really significant conversations with, and we've got right to the national level of friendship centers, is the work that they can do in the urban settings for Indigenous people in those settings. And so we've had a real great opportunity to engage them, figure out what some of their challenges were. We've communicated some of that through to the minister's office, like I spoke of earlier. And we've tried to share some of their frustrations and try to assist them in as many ways as we can to serve the people that they're trying to serve in those urban centers. They're still members of their First Nations. They're still members of their local bands or their local Inuit communities or their local Métis communities, but they're served by a kind of different segment of the way the system works. So we've identified some shortfalls, some gaps that they've identified, and we've tried to help them as well provide the best level of advice and service they can to the people off reserves.
I think I agree with you. I think friendship centers are sometimes overlooked in the grand scheme of things, and the work that they provide is so valuable to the people within urban centers and providing those links. I think the unfortunate part is sometimes they might be overlooked, but they really shouldn't, because they are just so valuable to those Indigenous people living in urban centers.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think one of the challenges that we've identified that we will kind of advocate for going forward is literally the place they kind of fall in this jurisdictional no man's land where they're dealing with First Nations or other Indigenous people in urban settings, but because, like I said before, they fall under a provincial jurisdiction. So they get some funding from the federal government, but they provide a lot of services that are supplemented by provincial governments. So I think there's a bit of a crack there that maybe we could kind of advocate for helping fill to make sure that that those people don't get left out in times like this.
So you might have heard on the news, being an Ontario guy myself, we've up in Sioux Lookout, they've had their first case of COVID-19. I know this is showing in other parts of the country. So this is, again, we're all dealing with it. We're all trying to stop the spread of it. And the challenge you mentioned, I just want to quickly go back to it. I know we're running out of time, but you mentioned on it, I just want to focus a little bit more. There was articles also about this, about field hospitals being set up. And you mentioned earlier the military potentially as a unit that could help out deliver these services. I guess the question is, what I know also the military is preparing to be mobilized. Where do you get the sense of until at what point do we see some mobilization? Are they going to wait and see, or are they going to get ready, I guess, now?
I think, in fairness, the challenge is that where and how many of these field hospitals do you try to set up across the country? I know I had the discussion directly with the minister's office about my own riding, and was suggesting, well, there's a couple obvious locations where we could do this, right? But if you go riding by riding across the country, there would be hundreds of these locations where we potentially would have to set up a field hospital on a preventative basis. And I think the choice would be very difficult as to where you do that. So I think that I think the reality of it is that this is going to have to be something where if there's an outbreak, that's where the services will probably end up going. I would suggest. I think you want to do as much as you can preventatively, and I've been actually amazed by what many of the First Nations leaders have done. And even the particular one you're referring to this morning in Ontario, I know I read that they have taken steps to prepare opportunities within their community for isolation if there is people that become infected. They're talking about using, I mean, schools have, schools are empty right now for the most part, right? There's facilities there, and they've taken some initiative to make sure that they prepare their facilities within their communities if necessary to isolate people. So they're trying to follow exactly the same health advice that all of us are being told to follow, and that's isolate, stay separate, wash your hands. I mean, I get there's challenges in these communities with some of the water issues, but they're trying to follow the same things that we're doing across the country. And at this point, with the number of cases we have in First Nations communities across the country, I would suggest they're doing a very good job so far, because there is not that many cases, and these leaders are doing tremendous jobs. But I think they're going to have, the reality is they're going to utilize some of the resources they have in their communities to make sure they isolate, make sure they use some of their schools or maybe rec centers or whatever they need to do. But my understanding is that the minister has assured me that the Army is there, mobilized, ready to go if they determine the need is appropriate for them to do that.
So we only have time for a little bit more here, Gary. I do apologize. I know I have many more questions for you, but just on a personal level, you're newly elected in 2019. You were the mayor of Meadow Lake for quite some time. How is this crisis showing to be very different from you? I guess being mayor, you would have a lot more on your plate in terms of actual delivery of services within your community, and now a lot of it is coordinating and trying to solve problems at a different level.
Yeah, I think it is different. I mean, fortunately, in my time as mayor, I never had to deal with this kind of a crisis at the municipal level. So I'm thankful for that. But I've tried to be a support for the current mayor now, and we've had a few conversations about any kind of advice I could give him from my time in the chair. But this is a very different role that I find myself in. The mayor's role is very localized, right? Before the crisis kind of stuff, it's like, you run into somebody in a grocery store and you're talking about potholes and you're talking about this kind of stuff. And to move to kind of things on a larger riding basis and then even on a national basis is a very different approach to how you serve people. It's more on a higher level policy perspective and some of that. At the same time, we deal with individual people that are trying to make their way through these programs and through the challenging things where they're trying to figure it out. So at the constituent level, we're doing a lot of that one-on-one stuff, but you're looking at a lot of things from a national perspective rather than a local perspective. And it's an interesting blend of what maybe I know and what I'm continuing to learn every day.
Any parting shots, Gary? Any words
I probably
of wisdom?
wouldn't be nice to you. I'll take those in our seats someday down the road, Jamie.
I meant words of wisdom more than parting shots. Any messages you'd like to leave before we sign off and go to John Barlow?
You know what? I think I would say what so many people are saying. Follow the advice of the experts that say, stay home, stay isolated, stay apart from people. Follow the rules. In lots of places, it seems to be working. So let's cooperate with our health officials kind of at the federal level, at the provincial level, and make sure we're doing the right things to protect ourselves, protect our families, and protect those in our communities around us.
Now, I know I'm trying to sign off because I had John Barlow waiting, but you keep saying things that kind of want me to ask another question. I will, because you mentioned about the province. How is the province of Saskatchewan dealing with the issue? They have a lot more in terms of service delivery, in terms of actual health care. How is this whole situation putting strain, or how are they dealing with this increased volume within their healthcare system?
I think, I wouldn't want to be the premier and his inner people having to make those decisions day by day. I realize that's a huge challenge for them, but I think they've actually done a really good job in Saskatchewan. They've been upfront and have communicated very well. I think they've managed it to this point quite effectively. In fact, yesterday the premier said that we had 10 more recoveries than we had new cases in Saskatchewan yesterday. So they actually had a net decrease of active cases in our province. So that's hopefully, I haven't seen any numbers today, but I on their sake and on our province's sake, I hope that's a trend that we're going to continue to see going forward. But I think overall they've shown really good leadership, and I'm happy to work with them.
Now, are you seeing any issues with agriculture at the moment? I know I'm going to ask John Barlow that momentarily, but obviously your province is a big producer of many parts of our value chain here in terms of agriculture and supply chain. How are your farmers holding up? Are they okay? I know it can be very stressful for them.
You know what, actually, everybody knows my riding, Jamie, as the one with 70% Indigenous population, but a very, very significant portion of my riding is actually agriculture community as well. So it's a very, very significant part of the industry in my riding. And I think the farmers, it's a challenge. I mean, some of the stuff that was offered in the COVID crisis stuff hasn't really effectively helped them a whole lot. It's just, gave them access to some more debt. And in fact, most of this debt was already announced back in the election campaign. So there's really been nothing new for the farmers. So what we've tried to do is just make sure we advocate for them to say, okay, is there some things going on in the context of making sure they can put their crops in? I mean, the carbon tax fight obviously is a big one. We did as Saskatchewan caucus, we did quite a push on April 1st with the increase in the carbon tax. That's huge in our ag sector, and those costs are crippling them. So we kind of focused on some of that early on to try to help them in their challenge. But I think one of the things, and John will probably talk about this, this might be one of the most important crops that our ag sector has ever put in the ground, right? There's an ever increasing acknowledgement or awareness of people in our country of food security or the potential lack of food security. And so I know one of the things we kind of facetiously talk about is a lot of people in urban settings, when they go to the grocery store, I'm not sure they know where that loaf of bread comes from, or where that 4-liter jug of milk comes from, or where that beef it just comes from the grocery store, right? So we've tried to focus on making a link between our egg producers and that supply in the grocery store, because people are aware of that right now, and we should have a new sense of appreciation for our farmers. So the fact that this is maybe one of the most important crops ever, we got to make sure that our farmers get looked after. We got to make sure they get these crops in the ground, or next fall could be a very, very difficult situation for all of us. So I would just continue to work for and praise my farmers for the work they do every day.
Absolutely, 100%. You keep giving me lots of content here, so I'm going to keep firing questions at you. When you talk about the importance of agriculture, when you talk about the importance of domestic production, whether it be food, whether it be manufacturing, at the end of the day, we all say we want this back. And I think we all agree on that. I think this situation has shown why domestic production is so important. But I think what's also key, what also has to be part of this conversation when you're talking about domestic production, is the fact that you need an environment that allows businesses, whether it be farm operations, whether it be manufacturing, the chance to be competitive, which usually means lower taxes, reduced regulation of red tape, so that they're not just constantly, these businesses aren't constantly filling out one government form after another to comply with orders given down from Ottawa or some other faraway jurisdiction, that you let the people within reason do what they do best, which is provide jobs, opportunity, and wealth in our community, and allow these sections such as manufacturing, agriculture to be competitive on not only the domestic market, but on the world stage as well.
Jamie, I'd respond to that with this comment. In the year up to me trying to make the decision as to whether I would seek the nomination for the Conservative Party and actually run in the election, I had an opportunity to interact with somebody I would characterize as a very wise man. It was Stockwell Day, actually, and Stockwell Day said to me something that struck me. He said, "Investment is like water. It always runs in the route of least resistance." And if you think of the truth of that, we have to have an economy that attracts investment, that creates prosperity, that creates economic success and activity for entrepreneurs, for small business people, for those that are willing to take those. That creates jobs, that creates all of the opportunity. And at the end of the day, what it creates is it creates the ability for us as a society to have social programs and things in place for those that truly need our help when they need our help. And so if we don't have a successful economy that attracts investment, that creates good jobs, that creates opportunity, ultimately we will not have social programs that support people in their time of need as well.
Because jobs really don't exist based on whether a politician says they're going to exist or some bureaucrat saying it's going to exist. It exists because the environment is right for private sector growth. And if you look in Ontario, I don't mean to leave out other provinces and territories, but because I'm an Ontario person, this is so personal to me, is during the 13 years of Liberal rule, during their Green Energy Act, they basically made hydro electricity some of the highest in North America. And as such, they forced out and made it extremely hard for a lot of manufacturing in Ontario to succeed. And as a result, we lost almost 300,000 manufacturing jobs in the province alone. And so when we talk about ensuring they are competitive, government rules, regulations have a big piece to play in all of this.
Jimmy, that's exactly right. I mean, just the way you introduced this kind of little segment for us was our job as politicians is, in my opinion, our job as politicians is to create an environment where they have the opportunity to be successful and frankly, to get the heck out of their way and let them be successful, right? We need to create regulations. We need to keep, or lack of regulations maybe. And I mean, we got to do it in a way that's still safe and that still does the right things. But the tax environment, I mean, as an accountant for 30 years, I understand the tax environment and the impact it has on people very, very personally, because I sat across the desk from many people and helped them make those decisions about whether they invest money or whether they don't based on the returns and tax cost and regulatory environment. And those things were absolutely central to the decision making of the entrepreneurs that I dealt with every day over 30 years in my accounting practice. So you nailed it, that we, as politicians, we have to create an environment where they can succeed. And we can't consider success a dirty word, because the success of our entrepreneurs is ultimately the biggest job creator in our country. If we don't let them succeed, why would they want to go out and take the risk to create new jobs? And so, I mean, I've sat across the desk from people that said, why would I work harder to create new jobs when I'm going to get taxed at this rate to do that? And they said, you know what? I might as well take another 2 weeks off instead of working harder to create new jobs. And when I see that across the desk from a person in my accounting office over the years, it just made me shudder, to be honest with you, that we have a system that creates that kind of response in people. And so maybe that's one of the reasons I got involved in this, to say, enough of us that kind of get that have to become involved instead of just sitting back and complaining.
Well, I don't know, and maybe you have in your accounting practice, you have met that person, but I have yet to meet the person who says, I'm going to wake up in the morning, work my butt off to pay more taxes, to see more of my wages get taken by government. I don't think anyone does that. And when they get to the point where taxes are taking too much off, or to the point where they think it's excessive, that production, the productive people, stop producing. And that's where our society, and that's when our society hurts. And when we come out of this COVID-19 crisis, we are going to need those small business owners, those entrepreneurs, to kickstart our economy in a massive way and bring those jobs, that opportunity, and wealth back to us, or else, I hate to say it, we're going to be in big trouble.
You know what? If we don't do that, Jamie, we're going to have a structural, long-term issue with employment insurance programs that are being put in place. We need to create an environment where people can get back to work, and people want to get back to work. The vast majority of people don't want to sit on some social system. They want to work. They want to be productive. People don't object to paying taxes if it's at a reasonable level and they see the good it can do. Most people are fine with some of their hard-earned dollars going to help those in need, going to help those who truly need our help, paying for highways and hospitals and education. And people don't have an issue with that if it's done at a reasonable level and they're willing to work towards that. There is a line. And you'll see that if you go over history and do some case studies, you'll see there's a line. When you get to a certain point, people will, the disincentive of too high tax rates just stops that entrepreneurial spirit. And it's our job as elected officials to make sure that we don't allow that to happen.
Absolutely. Especially this is where the fight for conservatives come in, where we have to show the people why low taxes, less government equals more freedom, and that going the left's way, which is more taxes, more government restrictions, more top-down approach, is the worst way to go when you're trying to kickstart your economy and actually try to wean off a lot of these federal programs that we, during this crisis, and rightfully so, something has to be done, and countries all around the world are trying to figure out. But we're massively spending right now. We are putting a structure in place that is going to be it's going to have to be paid back at some point. And if the inclination on the left is to jack up taxes in order to pay for this, we are going to continue to have mass unemployment and not that grassroots production at the local level.
No, I fully agree that is one of the huge risks. I mean, even go back to one of my real frustrations in this whole journey we've been on over the last, well, I guess it's been a few years now, but even just the last months, is that our ability to spend now. Our finance minister and our prime minister keeps talking about we're in such great shape to be able to weather this. But boy, I would argue that, and one of the reasons that I ran for this position is because of my belief in balanced budgets and paying down debt. Before the COVID crisis, from 2015 until just before the COVID crisis, we're nearly $100 billion more in debt than we were when this government was elected in 2015. If we had that $100 billion in our arsenal right now, I think we'd be a lot better off to weather this storm than we are, because we spent $100 billion more than we took in the last 5 years. And so one of my frustrations is listening to our opponents talk about what great shape we're in. And we've stood back and always said we should be putting money away for a rainy day when times are good. And frankly, we didn't. We just kept spending and now the challenge is going to be ever so real as we try to even begin to dig ourselves out of this hole we've dug now.
Well, you remember even the time you were in the House of Commons, and for myself prior, the 4 years previous, constantly we were talking about the need to put money aside for the bad times that will come. And whether it's a recession or a disaster of some kind, in this case, a virus, this is why you need to pay off debt in the good times. You store money away and you prepare yourself. Stephen Harper did that after inheriting, in fairness, a surplus from Paul Martin and Jean Chrétien, but we paid off $40 billion of the national debt, preparing us for whatever disaster happened. In that case, it was a global economic recession, and Canada was the first one, the last one into the recession and the first one out. And that's done because we had a plan, and Conservatives had a plan. Yeah. And when you talk about people wanting to work, people not wanting to just receive a government check, I know people have to do it now because we're trying to stem the curve. But at the end of the day, look what's happened to your province. Look what's happened to Alberta. Look what happened when you have provinces that aren't able to access markets. Alberta being a prime example. You have energy that obviously there's a lot of other circumstances. You have a price war going on through the Middle East. You have the access to market. But at the end of the day, the demand for oil is going to return, and we want to provide that energy, which is responsibly extracted, and start to wean off the bad actors so that we are able to supply and provide those jobs here. And these are good paying jobs. And despite what Catherine McKenna says about them, providing meaningful jobs, they are meaningful. They are producing something of value for our society.
Absolutely. I mean, even one of the things we're talking about, I've heard some conversation within our own colleagues, Jamie, is the number of kind of shovel-ready projects ready to go in the resource sector. And a lot of people like to, obviously Alberta is the most significant one in that sector, but there's a lot of resource sector in my province as well. So this is something that we want to stand up and fight for as well in Saskatchewan. But there's a bunch of projects ready to go, and these are good paying jobs. They are going to meet a demand that is there. There is a demand for the resource sector still. It's not going away overnight. And that is one of the tools that can be used to get us out of this hole as we referred to a little bit early in the conversation, that is one of the tools that could be used to climb us out of that hole, is to go hard at some of these opportunities that are before us to create some very significant success in the short term, which is going to create an awful lot of tax revenue and economic activity for us to contribute back to this deficit that we've created through this process. So I just don't think we can ignore that sector as we come out of this. It's maybe one of our best opportunities to contribute meaningfully to the climb out of this hole that we're going to find ourselves in.
Well, Gary Vidal, thank you so much. I kept you longer. We've had some connection problems with John Barlow. So for those in Alberta, we'll have to get on John Barlow again. But thank you, Gary, for filling in and having the conversation about our Indigenous communities, but also the resource industry and just general financial awareness as we try to come out of the COVID-19 crisis.
Jamie, it's been my pleasure, and I hope to have the opportunity to sit in that chair with you in the House soon again.
I look forward to it. I miss seeing you every day, my friend. So as of today, April 7th, we have 17,063 confirmed cases of COVID-19 across Canada. So please, let's all do our part. Let's stay home. Let's stay safe. And we'll get through this as quick as possible. So we'll have another edition of The Blueprint on Thursday in a couple days' time. Hope you will join us then. Remember, please like it, share, comment, subscribe. Help us push back against the ever-moving liberal agenda. And as my friend Gary Vidal, my seatmate, said, it's going to be more important than ever after we recover from this crisis to promote financial literacy, to promote the fact that balanced budgets are important because the bad times will happen. So remember, low taxes, less government, more freedom. That's the blueprint.